For the vast majority of his time in the spotlight, the saga of Barack Obama's roots felt like a closed case. His father hailed from Kenya. His mother was a white woman from America. The African side and the European side were neatly divided, each occupying its own half of his identity. It was a straightforward story that stood unchallenged for decades. But in 2012, a group of genealogy experts went public with a discovery that shattered that simplicity. DNA testing had peeled back the layers of the Obama family tree to reveal a secret, not in his father's well-known lineage, but tucked away deep within his mother's history. It was a branch everyone had long assumed was purely European. What they uncovered connects the 44th president to one of the grimmest milestones in the American experiment, a specific 1640 court case that laid the groundwork for centuries of racial bondage. This link flows through the very last bloodline anyone thought to investigate. To grasp what the genetics actually showed, you have to first look at the history everyone thought they knew. Barack Obama Sr. entered the world in 1934, along the banks of Lake Victoria in the western reaches of Kenya. He was a member of the Luo, one of East Africa's most prominent Nilotic ethnic groups, a community whose spoken traditions recount a 1,000-year migration originating in the Bahr el Ghazal region of South Sudan. Their tongue is a branch of the Western Nilotic languages, part of a linguistic family tied to the Upper Nile Valley for several millennia. The elder Obama was raised in the tiny hamlet of Nyang Oma Kogalo, a settlement of just a few hundred souls on the lake's edge. The Luo population exceeded 4 million in Kenya alone, and their genetic code told its own prehistoric tale. A landmark 2009 study by the scientist Sarah Tishkoff surveyed 121 different African groups and noticed a strange detail about the Kenyan Luo. Even though they spoke a Nilotic language, their genetic markers grouped them more closely with the Bantu-speaking neighbors who surrounded them. This was the biological proof of intense cultural blending over centuries of southward movement. Obama's father carried the physical record of a migration that spanned half the continent. He eventually secured a scholarship, backed by the nationalist leader Tom Mboya, traveled to Hawaii, sat down in a Russian language class next to a young woman from Kansas, and the rest passed into the annals of American history. His mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, was a product of the American heartland. Her lineage was predominantly linked to English ancestors, with smaller strands of German, Scots-Irish, Welsh, and Swiss blood woven in. Her kin were landowners and tillers of the soil, families who had inhabited American territory since before the Revolutionary War. Researchers had successfully mapped her ancestry back to the Virginia colony, and further still, to a man named John Dunham, who left Bedfordshire, England, for the Plymouth colony in 1630. There was even a clear Irish connection through a third great-grandfather, Falmouth Kearney, who fled the village of Moneygall during the Great Famine of 1850. Every single branch of Ann Dunham's tree looked European. Every paper record supported that conclusion. So, when the team at Ancestry.com started digging into her past as part of a larger study on presidential roots, they expected more of the same. They looked for English smallholders and colonial pioneers, the standard building blocks of old stock America. They sifted through thousands of pages of marriage licenses, land grants, and colonial logs. For months, every scrap of paper told the same expected story. Then, buried in the archives of early Virginia, they stumbled upon a name that didn't belong. The Dunham family tree eventually merged with a line known as the Bunches. The Bunch family had been established in Virginia's York and New Kent counties since the mid-1600s. They were property owners and taxpayers, appearing regularly in court documents and land tax rolls. On the surface, they were white. They had been categorized as such for hundreds of years. Their peers viewed them as white. The government census workers listed them as white. No one had any reason to doubt it. But when current members of the Bunch family agreed to provide DNA samples for a separate genealogical study, the trail took a sudden turn. The researchers at Ancestry.com examined the Y DNA, the male line passed from father to son, and found it belonged to haplogroup E1b1a. This is not a marker found in Europe. It is sub-Saharan African. More specifically, the subbranch E1b1a8a is most common in West and Central Africa, heavily linked to the Bantu migrations that transformed the continent over the last few thousand years. The Bunch family's biological signature was African, and it had been hiding in the open for nearly 4 centuries. The mystery then became, how? How does an African bloodline weave itself into a colonial Virginia family, survive hundreds of years of marrying white settlers, and then vanish from the written record entirely? The answer is found in one of the most misunderstood eras of early colonial life. Before Virginia turned racial slavery into a rigid legal system, the walls between the races were far more porous than they would later become. In the 1620s and 30s, people of African, European, and indigenous descent often worked side by side as indentured laborers. Some Africans gained their freedom once their contracts ended. Some bought land, some wed white colonists, and their offspring followed the English legal tradition of inheriting the status of the father, or, as Virginia later decided, the mother. This was the window the genealogists focused on. They had African DNA in a family that had passed as white since the early 1700s. They had the Bunch surname, which was incredibly rare in the colony, and they knew there were fewer than 100 African men in all of Virginia before 1640. Both the paper trail and the genetic evidence converged on a single man. His name was John Punch. Punch was an African man, likely brought to the Virginia wilderness in the late 1630s. Some historians suspect he was part of a group of captives taken from the kingdom of Ndongo in what is now Angola, loaded onto Portuguese ships, and eventually seized by English pirates. He was serving as an indentured laborer for Hugh Gwynn, a prominent tobacco farmer and local judge in Charles River County. Gwynn's lands were spread across the Tidewater region, where the tobacco trade was exploding, and the work required to fuel it was lethal, with servant death rates often topping 40% in a given year. In 1640, Punch made a choice that would redefine American law. He ran away alongside 2 European laborers, a Dutchman named Victor and a Scotsman named James Gregory. They headed north toward the Maryland border, 3 men from 2 different continents, united by a single urge to be free. All 3 were caught. All 3 were sent back to Virginia, and on July 9, 1640, the Virginia Governor's Council, acting as the highest court in the land, issued a verdict that sliced through the future of the country. Victor and Gregory, the European servants, were sentenced to a public whipping of 30 lashes, 1 extra year of service to their master, and 3 more years of labor for the colony. It was a harsh sentence, but it was finite. John Punch was given something far more permanent. The court decreed that he shall serve his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life. Not a few extra years, not a fine. For the exact same act committed by 3 men acting together, the African man alone was sentenced to life in chains. There was no law on the books for this. No English legal tradition supported it. The court simply made it so. And in that moment, they created what many scholars call the first recorded instance of legal life enslavement in the English colonies, more than 20 years before Virginia formally drafted its first slave laws. Before we explore what this means for the truth of Obama's ancestry, if you're gripped by this piece of history, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss our upcoming deep dives. Now, here is the detail the Ancestry.com team spent over 500 hours meticulously verifying. Sometime before that 1640 ruling, John Punch appears to have had a son with a white woman. Because that mother was a free person, the child was born into freedom. That boy was likely named John Bunch, with the P softening to a B in the messy spelling of colonial records, a frequent quirk of history where clerks wrote names phonetically. John Bunch and his children inherited the mother's free status. They became landowners. They married into the white families living nearby. Within just a few generations, the Bunch clan was indistinguishable from their neighbors of European descent. The African roots of their founding father simply faded from memory. Elizabeth Shone Mills, a former leader of the Board for Certification of Genealogists, reviewed the findings independently. She measured the DNA data against the laws and social norms of the 17th century. Her verdict was clear. The Y-DNA proof of African ancestry was, as she put it, indisputable, and every surviving document pointed to John Punch as the only logical forefather. The evidence is stunningly specific. First, there is the DNA. The The Y-DNA of the Bunch family remains consistent across 67 separate markers, proving a shared ancestor beyond any doubt. The haplogroup places that ancestor squarely in sub-Saharan Africa. Second, look at the records. Before 1640, there were fewer than 100 African men in Virginia. John Punch is the only one with a name that mirrors Bunch, who was documented in the exact county where the Bunch family first appears. Third, the timing fits. John Bunch I appears in the records by the late 1630s, perfectly aligning with Punch having a child just before his life sentence. What this data eliminates is just as vital. This isn't a fluke. The overlap of biology, history, and geography, focusing on one person across 4 centuries, rules out simple chance. This isn't a lab error or a contaminated sample. Multiple descendants were tested in isolation, and the results were identical. This isn't a guess about some random African ancestor. The trail leads to one specific man, in one specific place, at a pivotal moment in the law. The implication essentially rewrites the narrative of Obama's identity through his mother's side. The 44th president is a direct descendant of the man who may mark the very beginning of legalized slavery in America. 11 generations stand between them. Genealogist Joseph Shumway summarized it with striking clarity. 2 of the most significant African-descended figures in the nation's history are kinsmen. One was the first man legally bound to a life of slavery. The other became the leader of the Western world. However, the story does have its critics. Historians at Boston University challenged one part of the Ancestry.com report. The claim that Punch's DNA pointed specifically to Cameroon. Their critique was based on decades of data regarding the Atlantic slave trade. They argued that before 1640, there was no active slave trade coming out of Cameroon. Most Africans brought to Virginia by the Portuguese in that era were taken from Angola, where the slave trade was a well-oiled machine. The E1B1A haplogroup, they noted, is found all across Africa, from Nigeria to the Congo and down into Angola. It is the genetic ghost of the Bantu expansion. But because modern DNA databases have more samples from Cameroon than Angola, the software tends to lean toward Cameroon. The historians believe John Punch was almost certainly Angolan. The DNA confirms his African origin, but his specific home remains a question mark, limited by the data we have today. There is a profound irony exposed by this genetic mapping. Modern research suggests that about 4% of Americans who identify as white actually carry at least 1% African DNA. In parts of the Deep South, those numbers climb even higher, reaching 13% in South Carolina and over 12% in Louisiana. The Bunch family isn't a freak occurrence. They are a window into a hidden process that happened all across the colonial South, a multi-century blending of bloodlines that American racial laws were designed to hide. The 1662 Virginia law, known as Partus Sequitur Ventrum, which dictated that a child's status followed the mother, provided the loophole for this to happen. Children of free white women and African fathers were born free, and over the centuries, their descendants simply merged into the white population. Today, if you visit the Obama homestead in western Kenya, you can find the land where his grandfather lived, where the Luo language still uses Bantu words picked up over centuries of migration. And if you follow the other branch of his African story, the one no one knew existed, the path takes you to a very different landmark. It leads to a colonial courthouse in 1640 Virginia, to 3 men fleeing through the woods toward Maryland, risking their lives for a taste of freedom. Only one of them was told he could never stop serving. That man, America's first legal slave, left behind a family that became free landowners, then white Americans, and eventually the family of a president who broke the ultimate barrier. Obama himself has often reflected on how complex his identity is. Journalist David Marinis, who spent years retracing the president's steps, noted that while Obama was African American by skin color and paternal heritage, he wasn't raised in that culture. He had to discover it. The DNA evidence makes that discovery even more layered. His African American roots don't come from where we thought. They flow from both sides of his tree, through 2 separate centuries, 2 different continents, and 2 completely different versions of the African experience in the New World. If this hidden history fascinated you, subscribe for more stories that the evidence is only just beginning to tell. Here is the final thought. If the Bunch family's secret lasted 400 years and 7 generations before reaching a mother in Kansas, how many other American stories are waiting to be uncovered?